He had footage which he said showed that protesters were being ferried around by ANC councillors, and not just normal protest. I mean, obviously anybody's allowed to protest, but violent, obstructive protests, damaging infrastructure, preventing people from using roads and so on. So I think we could see that kind of thing.
With the 2024 general election approaching ever faster, we wanted to look a little bit at the prospect of whether the current governing party, the African National Congress, might give up power peacefully or not, should the party come in under 50% in the elections next year, as is widely projected by most surveys and polls. For that exercise, we undertook a client note, which you can access on our website if you're a subscriber. If not, we of course invite you to become a client of the CRA. Joining me to unpack the client note and some of the findings is the author, Marius Roodt from the Institute of Race Relations. Marius, thanks very much, as always, for being with us. Just to start off with your sort of initial impressions in terms of undertaking this particular research of where does one start if you want to look at whether the ANC would give up power peacefully should it lose the majority in the elections next year?
Well, I think you have to look at what's happened in the past, and the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. And as I say in the client note, the ANC lost power in South Africa before. It was voted out in the Western Cape. It's been voted out in municipalities across the country, and it's given up power relatively peacefully, or has given up power peacefully. But as I say in the client note, national power or being in national government is a quite different beast from controlling the city of Cape Town or, Umgeni in KwaZulu-Natal or the Western Cape. Obviously, these are centers of power in their own right, but national government is a much different beast to these kinds of things, with much more power and access to patronage and so on than these kind of smaller units. But as I say, past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior, and the ANC has given up power. But then at the same time, we've seen how they've acted when they have been out of power. And we can go into it a bit, and how they have, when they have been on the opposition benches, they've not been they've been quite a, what's the word I'm looking for? Obstructive opposition. So obviously, the job of an opposition is to not necessarily make the government's life easy, but it also shouldn't be making the government's life completely, torturous. And I think the ANC has been doing that in a lot of ways. And I think if the ANC had to lose power, I think there'll be a lot of ways that they would try to make a new government's life difficult, both through legal means and through illegal.
So what might some of those means be? I mean, we could one looks at the policies that have been implemented by the ANC since it has been in national government since 1994, things like BEE, cadre deployment, state-owned entities, sort of maintaining those monopolies and strengthening them in some ways through continued bailouts, even when they don't perform. Are those some of the ways that could continue ANC influence and power, as it were? I mean, and the easiest example is cadre deployment, because then you are put in that position based on your political preference and your connection. So you want to, if you're in that position, sort of human, incentives, as it were, you want to continue reciprocating that. So then you might undermine a new government coming in. And potentially that new government could also be a coalition government. So then do you just play to those coalition partners and you decide you sort of go where the wind blows? It's not about state institutions as such. It's more about where your particular political loyalty lies.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. We also know the issue of cadre deployment. And even apart from that, there's probably a lot of civil servants who have sympathies with the ANC, even if they're not necessarily card-carrying members and so on. And there's certainly anecdotal evidence that ANC civil servants or employees of municipalities and so on have been obstructive, obstructive on purpose to make life more difficult for coalition governments or anti-ANC coalition governments that have come to power. I know that in Ekurhuleni, I know somebody who was appointed as by the DA government there, who said, in as many words, ANC officials came to him and said, "We are going to make your life as difficult as possible." So I think this is the kind of thing we could expect if the ANC had to lose power. We'll see a lot of obstruction from, I think, as I was saying, civil servants. And unfortunately, I think this is not something we can be ruled out. But I think the ANC could also direct violence and illegal means of protest to make a new government's life quite difficult. We've seen there's been a lot of sabotage and so on in the Western Cape. And we know, I mean, this kind of rhetoric isn't as common as it used to be, but when the ANC first lost power in the Western Cape, the ANC Youth League at the time spoke about making the province ungovernable and all this kind of thing. In Umgeni in KwaZulu-Natal, which is so far the first and only municipality that the DA's won in KwaZulu-Natal, also won that municipality outright, the 2021 elections. There were protests around there, and Chris Papas, the DA mayor of Umgeni, he had footage which he said showed that protesters were being ferried around by ANC councillors, and not just normal protest. I mean, obviously anybody's allowed to protest, but violent, obstructive protests, damaging infrastructure, preventing people from using roads and so on. So I think we could see that kind of thing. And so there'll be a lot of ways I think that the ANC could look to undermine governance of the opposition. I think we could also see if the opposition coalition does take power in South Africa, probably most provinces will still be governed by the ANC, even if the opposition coalition comes to power nationally. So I think there'll be quite a lot of friction between, let's call it Pretoria, and the various regional centres of power. And also remember, National Council of Provinces they would also actually, even though we could have an opposition majority in the National Assembly, in the National Council of Provinces, we could have an ANC majority. So we could see lots of fighting between the different houses of parliament. So, and that would also have lots of implications for service delivery and, just the smooth running of the country, stability of governance. So there's lots of ways that the ANC could still undermine an opposition coalition, even if it's prepared to give up power peacefully at the ballot box.
And therein lies the sort of work for those opposition parties, which is not to say that they haven't already engaged in that work and undertaken it, but again, reinforcing this idea that one shouldn't take everything as sort of smooth sailing just because things might turn for you at the ballot box. Marius, just a final question to link this to some trends we're seeing in the latest round of by-elections. What are you seeing pointing to possible outcomes next year? I know one oughtn't use by-elections as an indicator. It's just a snapshot at a fixed point in time. But in what's happened in the last 2 weeks, is anything maybe in a particular province for you pointing in a certain direction?
Yeah, so there were 11 by-elections, I think, 2 Wednesdays ago, and they pretty much confirmed the trends that we've been seeing. So there were 3 by-elections in George in the Western Cape, which had been held by Good, the wards. Good lost all of those, 2 to the DA and 1 to the PA. And the DA managed to, the wards they won fairly easily. PA also didn't do too bad in the ward it won. So I think and Good did absolutely terribly. So I think what shows you now is that the ANC was nowhere really. I think in the one ward it didn't even field a candidate, which is quite surprising. The ANC generally fields candidates in nearly every single by-election, even if there's no chance of winning. So I think it tells you that it's going to be a straight shoot in the rural Western Cape, or most of the rural Western Cape, I think, between the DA and the PA. The ANC will probably be there in a couple of places. And I think the DA will be quite heartened by this result. I think it seems to show that they're holding up pretty well in the rural Western Cape. So I think they'll be quite confident of retaining their majority in that province next year. And the PA, I know I saw a new poll by our former colleague, Frans Cronje. He was saying that the PA is looking at getting about 7%, 8% of the vote in the Western Cape, which I think is about right. Also, if we look at how they did in this recent by-election. But there was something concerning. I mean, this is hearsay at the moment. So Tertius Simmers, I think he's the leader of the DA in the Western Cape, or if he's not, he's a senior official there. He said that the PA was involved in vote buying and handing out food parcels in the ward at one. So that's something that's to be a bit concerned about, since I'm going to have to keep an eye on. I think that could be happening quite a lot going into the 2024 election. That also has happened in KwaZulu-Natal, apparently. There was a by-election about 6 weeks or so ago where the ANC won off the IFP, which is quite surprising. And the leader of the IFP, Velenkosi Glabisa, said that was also because the ANC had been giving people food parcels and so on. But staying in KwaZulu-Natal, when we had the same round of by-elections in George, there were 2 by-elections in KwaZulu-Natal, one in Nkandla and one in Mtonjaneni, which is kind of Malmeth, which is kind of central KwaZulu-Natal, north central KwaZulu-Natal. So in Nkandla, there was a ward held by the IFP, if I remember correctly. IFP won it pretty easily, or retained it pretty easily. Mtonjaneni ward, had been an ANC ward that was won by somebody from the IFP. So that carries on with the trends we've been seeing, where the IFP is really doing well in KwaZulu-Natal, the ANC is doing really badly. I think this year the ANC's only won one ward off the IFP in KwaZulu-Natal, which is the ward I just mentioned, that Khabisa mentioned, and the IFP's won 6 wards off the ANC. But something that is very, very concerning, and this is not something we can ignore, is that apparently the councillor Ntonja Neni, the reason he resigned and gave up his councillor seat is because he was fearing for his life because of all the violence we've been seeing there and that kind of thing. And unfortunately, I think we're going to see more of that. I mean, just recently, I think at the end of June or beginning of July, ACDP councillor was killed in KwaZulu-Natal. There have even been attempted hits on DA councillors in KwaZulu-Natal. So I think that is extremely concerning, and it's something we're going to have to definitely keep an eye on going into 2024. And KwaZulu-Natal is likely to be, with Gauteng, it's probably going to be the 2 most highly contested provinces next year. So I think we're going to start seeing a lot of this kind of thing. And then just to wrap up, there were 6 other by-elections, and that's a round of by-elections, 4 in Mangaung, and 1 in Senqu, which is Berkeley East in Eastern Cape, and 1 in Rustenburg. And the ANC managed to hold on to all those wards pretty easily. So I think what it shows you is that the ANC is still pretty strong in rural South Africa, except for KwaZulu-Natal. And in the cities and KwaZulu-Natal, ANC is pretty much nowhere, and the Western Cape. But in the other 7 provinces outside the bigger urban areas, the ANC is holding up pretty well. And that's why, it's still in some places, and you look at ward elections, still getting 70, 80% of the vote. And that's why, that's what could save the ANC, save its bacon next year. That could keep it above 50%, or, only see it go a little bit under 50%. But that's the kind of pattern we've seen in Zimbabwe also. This was the pattern where ZANU-PF was pretty much nowhere in the cities and was saved by its vote in the rural areas. Even if we didn't have, this kind of mass rigging and violence you get in Zimbabwe, ZANU-PF would probably still be getting 30 or 40% of the vote. So, and I think that's what's going to save the ANC as well. It's already pretty much a rural party. In the 2021 local government elections, it only won 50% of the votes, won more than 50% of the votes in 2 cities, in Mangaung and Buffalo City. And actually, the party that did well in all the metros, if you look at overall majorities, the DA in Cape Town, Cape Town is now the least competitive metro in South Africa, when 15 years ago was most competitive. So now the DA is getting 60% of the votes in Cape Town. The ANC can't even dream about getting 60% of the votes in any of our cities anymore. So it's pretty much, So I think those ward by-elections, they've just confirmed the trends that we've been seeing. The ANC is pretty strong in rural South Africa, outside of Western Cape and KwaZulu-Natal. It's basically a spent force in KwaZulu-Natal and the Western Cape. And I think those ward by-elections just confirm those kind of trends.
Thank you very much for watching. If you have not yet subscribed to our YouTube channel, we invite you to do so. Please click on the big red button below this video. Also, before you leave a comment in this comment section below. Let us know your thoughts on our discussion. Until next time, this has been Chris Hattingh for the Center for Risk Analysis. Take care.